Central Park's Bitsy Brandenham is one of my favorite villains in recent memory. She's bitter, she's greedy, she's completely unempathetic to the people around her, and all of this makes her a perfect foil to the Tillerman family, who live their lives for the titular park and the connections they make around it. The stories told in Central Park are very frequently defined by the connections that Owen, Paige, Molly, and Cole have between each other and between the people who frequent the park. So it's no surprise that this is another area where Bitsy Brandenham stands out from the rest of the main cast for her lack of real connections. Her maid Helen is the only character she shares any sort of solidarity with, but that connection is built around Helen's plans to secure Bitsy's wealth for herself. You could argue that she does have a connection with her dog, Champagne, but it's also implied from the very first episode even that Cole has a much deeper connection with him. Bitsy's entire staff despising her is a constant thread that would get its own small arc in Season 3. And of course, you have Bitsy's family subjecting her to nothing but neglect and discontempt throughout her entire childhood. Even the Brandenham Hotel, Bitsy's entire life's work, is a living monument to the loneliness that has shaped Bitsy's life, as the only reason she inherited it is because nobody else in the family wanted it. Bitsy Brandenham is a character who is defined entirely by her loneliness, and this is made the most apparent in one of my favorite episodes of the show, Season 2's The Shadow, an episode which gives us more insight into Bitsy's past than any other episode in the series. It goes without saying, but this video is going to be filled with spoilers for the episode, so for the people who care, here's your spoiler warning. This episode opens as most episodes of Central Park do, with Birdie setting up the plot. Birdie quickly explains that this story will be centered entirely around the Brandenham Hotel and the episode's namesake, The Shadow, an infamous jewel thief that terrorized wealthy hotels many years ago. We then cut immediately to the first song of the episode, also titled The Shadow. Right away, there's a lot to love about this number. The fluid animation, stylized as if it were the opening of a cartoon from the 60s, makes it one of the most visually appealing songs in the show, and the high-energy jazz music accompanying the sequence complements it really nicely. I especially love being able to hear Daveed Diggs sing at a range he normally doesn't when he's playing Helen. Really makes the track stand out. In terms of what it does for the story, this song establishes the basic outline for who the Shadow is. It explains that the Shadow only targets the wealthy, and that they typically steal items that would be considered difficult to get to. Jewels locked inside of hotel safes and stuff like that. It puts a big emphasis on how the Shadow steals from the rich in particular, for reasons that we'll dig into a bit more later. In fact, I might as well let you know now, I have to do a bit of summarizing before I get into the more analytical part of this video. This episode is a lot of setup in the first half for a lot of payoff in the second. After the song ends, we see somebody breaking into this room in the Brandenham at night, entering a security code into the safe and walking out with a necklace. The next morning, the woman staying there walks out to discover that her necklace is gone, and we cut straight to a group of police officers investigating. Bitsy and Helen stop by the scene out of courtesy, with Bitsy complaining the whole way through, as is usual for her. And then we meet insurance agent Hank Zabansky, who's also here to investigate the theft. I love this character. He's really funny and memorable, especially for this being the only episode he appears in. My favorite thing about him is that he's extremely Columbo-coded. Everything from his design to Henry Winkler's line delivery screams Peter Falk. In fact, because I wanted to be certain of this before I wrote it into the video, I reached out to the episode's director, Mario Dana, on Instagram, and he confirmed that they were in fact going for a Peter Falk-type character with Hank. Right away, we see some of that in the writing when Hank distracts Bitsy by drawing her attention to his coworker Sal so he can swipe one of her Bloody Marys. Right away, we get a sense that Hank is smarter than he's letting on. Classic Columbo. Later in the day, Hank tells Bitsy that this case is very similar to the thefts committed by the Shadow 56 years ago. Hank mentioning it is actually the first time we hear how long ago the Shadow thefts were. Bitsy's immediate response is to get defensive and outright deny the existence of the Shadow. But because Helen doesn't know who the Shadow is, Hank is given an excuse to start explaining it. I love how they tie this in with a joke about Bitsy not knowing how old Helen is, which actually helps cement what I said earlier about how artificial their connection really is. Hank starts talking about his time on the force during the Shadow thefts, and we see the entire thing from his perspective, giving us more details than the first song did. First, he says outright what the song only alluded to, that the Shadow targeted hard-to-reach jewels in luxury hotels. What they reveal next, though, is something that wasn't mentioned in the song. The Shadow had a calling card, a crumpled up candy wrapper in a very specific shape.
What was the shape? A penis.
As Hank and Helen are discussing the shadow, Bitsy continues to deny that the case somehow involves them, and proceeds to explain how the story of the shadow ruined the reputation of the Brandon Ham. This adds some really interesting context to the series as we know it thus far. At this point, we've already heard in previous episodes that Bitsy inherited the Brandon Ham because nobody else wanted it, and that it took years of hard work for her to make it into the success that it is in the present day. Now we know that the specific reason for that is because the shadow ruined the business they had at the time, because everybody was afraid to stay there. Even later in the day, Hank is still searching the room, and of course, Bitsy is furious, both by her inability to sell rooms on that floor because of the investigation, and because of Hank's insistence that this burglary was done by the shadow. In response, Hank starts pointing out the similarities between the cases. He shows Bitsy that the thief used a passkey on the door and a security bypass code to get into the safe, and he points out that almost nobody breaks into a hotel room where the guest is sleeping anymore, because it's high risk. We're learning in this scene, as Hank is explaining this to Bitsy, that all of these things were apparently part of the Shadow's regular MO. And as Hank is explaining away, he's still searching around the room for the Shadow's calling card, and Bitsy reaches a breaking point. Angry as hell and desperate to avoid any rumors of the Shadow ruining the Brandon Ham again, Bitsy takes it into her own hands and confesses.
This isn't the Shadow, you nincompoop!
Huh? How do you know?
Because I was the Shadow!
Bitsy confesses to Hank that she was the Shadow, and as we'll find out very quickly, she isn't even lying like you would expect her to be. At this point, having outed herself to the only other person in the room, Bitsy lets her guard down for possibly the only time in the entire show and begins explaining herself. We get a direct glimpse at Bitsy's home life for the first time in the show. We see how even after she dropped out of school and moved back to the hotel, her family never really paid her any mind. This complete lack of care that the Brandon Ham family had for Bitsy left her angry, bored, and craving attention. And then, a woman enters the hotel. A tall woman wearing fabulous jewels that caught everyone's eye. A woman bearing a striking resemblance to the Shadow's first victim as seen in the opening number. I love the juxtaposition this scene gives us to the beginning of the episode. The Shadow, that is the song, framed the Shadow, that is the thief, as more of a Robin Hood-like figure, robbing the rich out of a sense of justice. But that song was from an outsider's perspective, clearly written in universe by somebody who didn't know the truth of who the Shadow was. In learning that truth, we see that it was the opposite of what the first song only assumed. The burglaries were committed out of envy by Bitsy Brandon Ham, someone who's just as, if not richer, than the people being stolen from here. This leads us into the second song of the episode, That Was All Me, which sees a younger Bitsy Brandon Ham detailing her thefts as the Shadow, her methods for breaking and entering, and how she got away with it. The song itself is another banger, with Keela Settle lending her voice to a younger Bitsy. I love that they decided to have this song be another jazz tune because it's about the same events. But it's still very distinct from the opening number, using a slightly faster tempo and a higher overall energy to reflect that it's from the perspective of the actual thief. This is seen in the visuals as well. It's mostly animated in Central Park's regular style, but it occasionally repurposes visual cues and motifs from the opening number. The opening number was more stylized because it was a story being told by an outsider, whereas this song isn't just a story, it's Bitsy's actual memories. And building off of that, you could even argue that the reason they had Daveed Diggs sing The Shadow is because Helen, the character he plays in the show, didn't actually know anything about them other than what she was told. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What does the song actually tell us? The song shows us that Bitsy used a passkey on the door and a bypass code on the safes, as Hank already suspected. But we also learned that while robbing other hotels, she would use her parents' money to bribe the employees into helping her. And ultimately, she would get off scot-free because nobody suspected that a woman, let alone a woman as small as her, would be behind the thefts. The most interesting part of the song, though, is surprisingly when we learn the reasoning behind the calling card.
No, don't say it. You said it.
Bitsy explains that the calling cards were directed specifically at her father because he would often tell Bitsy outright that he wanted a son instead of her. And yeah, that's a really cruel thing to tell your child. But then you may be wondering, why have such a specific calling card if you're not trying to get caught? Well, after the song ends, Bitsy admits that part of her wanted to get caught, so everybody would notice her and see what she's capable of. Everybody, naturally including her father. Imagine him being confronted with that, and Bitsy telling him the reason for the calling cards. In the end though, Bitsy never did get caught, and she never fenced the jewels either. Not that it would have made a difference, because by the time her parents passed away, the Brandon was millions of dollars in debt, presumably between the insurance claims from the Shadow's victims and the reputation of the Brandon having plummeted for that same reason. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Bitsy Brandonham's entire life was shaped by loneliness. Let's recap. Bitsy Brandonham, angry because of the complete neglect she faced in her day-to-day life, began stealing expensive jewels from the rich people staying at her parents' hotel. This led directly to that hotel being put in the worst state it's ever been in, and that is the very reason Bitsy inherited it. Bitsy then had to spend decades rebuilding the Brandonham's reputation, which was only as bad as it was because of her own actions. And she had to do so with no support from the rest of her family, who've spent this entire time treating her as the black sheep, paying her just as little mind as her parents did. It's because of this that everything she does for status. She does it so she'll be noticed by her peers or to impress her now deceased parents. This is even true in the present. So many of Bitsy's storylines revolve not just around her trying to buy Central Park, but around her doing something to increase her reputation and notoriety. And whenever she is pitching her plans to buy Central Park to someone, she goes out of her way to point out that it would be the biggest real estate deal in history, as if that accomplishment is something that would bring her and anyone who joined her in that venture more acclaim than they already have. But despite everything she does to prove that she's worth something, her staff despises her, and her family ignores her. Her only connections, if you could even call them that, are with Helen, who just wants her money, and her rivalries with her brother and the Tillerman family. And, as we learn in this episode, with Hank. After Bitsy finishes explaining everything, Hank admits to doing the most Columbo thing known to man. It turns out that he staged this entire thing. He called in favors with his friends on the force and with the woman whose necklace was supposedly stolen. Also, he could get Bitsy to admit that she was the Shadow. The constant references to the Shadow retroactively being revealed as his way of getting under Bitsy's skin and making her angry enough to oust herself. Again, classic Columbo. We learned that Hank did all this because he saw Bitsy all those years ago, stealing lipstick from somebody's purse in an elevator, and instead of saying anything, he let her go. But he never really stopped thinking about it, or about the Shadow case. Bitsy's reaction is very telling here. When Hank says that she left a big impression on him, you could see her perk up a bit, and you could hear the delight in Stanley Tucci's line delivery. 56 years later, and Bitsy finding out that somebody noticed her at that point in her life still makes her happy. Even if it's just for a moment. The whole scene is lined with implications of romance between Hank and Bitsy as we transition into our third song, A Moment Forever Ago, a flashback sequence set to a gorgeous piano and violin track with Gavin Creel giving his voice to a young Hank Sabansky. We see that moment in the elevator I mentioned, where Hank sees Bitsy stealing a tube of lipstick. Then the elevator opens, and as Hank gives chase, we see the colors in the background change. The people around them stay completely still, as if Hank and Bitsy are stuck in that moment together. And they begin dancing, first through the Brandonham, and then through Central Park. As the sequence ends, the two of them almost share a kiss before it cuts back to the elevator, and we see the colors of the scene shift back to normal, showing us that the previous sequence was only a dream. As we rejoin Bitsy and Hank in the present day, the real underlying tragedy of this episode sets in. It isn't just the fact that Bitsy's loneliness made her act out in a way that ruined her life. It's that the one person who actually noticed Bitsy never said anything. And if he did, everything could have been different.
You should have said something.
Yeah, I should have.
I actually think that's the reason they danced through Central Park during the song, showing us a possible affinity for the place that the Bitsy we know wants nothing more than to tear down and develop. It doesn't take long for Bitsy to go back to her bitter self. When she learns that Hank has a wife, she calls his happiness irritating. Then when Hank asks Bitsy if she's happy, she doesn't answer and changes the subject instead.
Want a little penis?
I've already got one.
Bitsy offering Hank a recreation of her old calling cards is actually one of the only intentionally nice things she does in the entire show. But even still, the story ends in an anticlimax as they part ways at the elevator. And because of Bitsy's embittered nature, she doesn't let Hank into her life any further. She makes it a point to have them go their separate ways, with no chance of even a friendship coming from this, because even though she now knows that she was seen all those years ago, she doesn't believe it matters anymore. And Birdie gives us a brief but very poignant summary.
You know, sometimes when just one person notices you, it makes all the difference.
Those words transition us into the final song of the episode, A Thing on Strings. At first glance, it seems like they just couldn't fill the entire episode with the Shadow story, so they needed to make another segment to cap the episode off with. I don't believe that's the case, but even if it is, I adore A Thing on Strings. It stands excellently on its own, of course, but the juxtaposition it brings to the main story is downright brilliant. This entire sequence has no spoken words. It's a story told completely by visuals and music, with pretty obvious inspiration coming from the opening of Pixar's Up. That's not a bad thing though, that's a really good thing to take inspiration from. We opened to multiple shots of Birdie's day-to-day life, walking through the park to a specific spot where he spends the day playing violin for the tips people put into his hat. The music in this section begins with steady strumming before transitioning into proper violin playing. We see Birdie living a life we normally would not think of him living, as he usually acts as the show's narrator. But here, we see just how lonely he is when he doesn't have a story to tell, busking in the park all day, being paid very little attention by the people passing by. One day, Birdie catches the attention of an older woman, being escorted through the park by her caregiver. She seems happy to just sit there and listen to Birdie playing, and just being noticed makes Birdie happy as well. During this part of the story, Birdie's violin is joined by a piano, a parallel to A Moment Forever Ago, which also only used those two instruments. The music picks up in tempo to match their happiness in each other's company, as we see Birdie playing for her across several days. But eventually, Birdie comes to the park, and his new friend is nowhere to be seen. He spends most of the day playing, visibly confused and wondering where she could be, until he's met by her caregiver. He starts explaining something to Birdie as the music slows down in tempo significantly to match the sudden drop in their mood. We flash back to a doctor's office. The caregiver is there with the older woman and her family. She's given a diagnosis that we don't get to hear, but judging by her family's reaction, we can tell that it's fatal. We watch some more time pass with the old woman being bedridden, this brief section of the song being exclusively piano. We see days, possibly even weeks pass by as her family members visit her periodically. Then, the violin takes over again as her caregiver opens the window and prepares to take her to the park at her request. As we slowly pass through the first day that her and Birdie saw each other again, his violin playing becomes more discordant and unsteady, matching the negative emotions running through Birdie's head as he remembers that first day, with the knowledge that this connection he made with her is gone now. He was able to brighten her life at its very end, but now it's over, and he's still here. Filled with uncertainty, Birdie begins the next day sitting on the bench, and despite the pain he must be feeling, he begins playing again, matching the music of the sequence as it steadies itself back out, and catches the attention of a young boy, who starts dancing along with Birdie for only a moment before his mother makes him move along. The ending of A Thing on Strings perfectly captures the theme of this episode. That theme is loneliness and the way that we react to it. I've already gone into detail about how that feeling of being completely alone and never being acknowledged shaped Bitsy Brandenham into the person that she is today. She was so embittered by that neglect that she closed herself off and became somebody who seemingly can't create real connections with people. But the same can't be said for Birdie, who, as we see in A Thing on Strings, generally lives a life that's just as lonely as Bitsy's, spending his days playing violin in the park, usually with little to no acknowledgement from the people around him. The key difference here is what happens to both of them when they do make a connection. When Bitsy learns about this history that she has with Hank, that she had been noticed all those years ago, she closes herself off from the thing that she used to want so desperately. She would rather return to the unhappy life that she leads than let herself be impacted by this. Birdie, on the other hand, forges a very strong friendship with a complete stranger just by playing his violin in the park the way he always does. And when that connection ends in heartbreak, he doesn't shut down or close himself off from the world. He keeps on playing, and he allows himself to continue making those connections. Bitsy lives her life only for herself, with no desire to forge new connections, whereas Birdie lives his life entirely for the people around him and is always eager to impact people's lives and have other people impact him. And in the end, Birdie is happy with his life, while Bitsy isn't happy with hers, because those connections are far more valuable than any level of status or acclaim, and that is the thing that Bitsy never learned.
The famous Bitsy Brandenham charm.
Oh, suck it.